Hello, everyone. I'm Daz, and welcome to American Civil War and UK History podcast. This presentation is available as a video on our YouTube channel and as a podcast wherever you get your podcast from. Remember, on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and TikTok. And today I'm joined by historian and friend Tim Willging. Welcome, Tim.
Hey, Daz. Good to see you again.
And today we're going to be discussing the Battle of Hampton Roads, which is a very famous naval battle during the American Civil War in March of 1862. So let's start with the story of Hampton Roads and where it starts. It actually starts in April 1861 at Gosport Shipyard in Virginia. And so just give us a little brief history, Tim, of the shipyard and the story leading up to what happens in April 1861.
Okay, so Shipyard actually dates back to the 18th century. It began as the Gosport Shipyard. It was destroyed during the Revolution, rebuilt afterwards, and became home to the first operational dry dock in the U.S. And there's been, to my understanding, a continuously operating dry dock at that location ever since. Today it is known as the Norfolk Naval Shipyard. Even though it's in a town across the Elizabeth River from Norfolk called Portsmouth. Congress passed, took it over basically in 1794 and basically leased the shipyard from the state of Virginia. The keel of the Chesapeake was laid there. Which was one of the first six frigates. So if you've ever heard of the six frigates book, Six Frigates, I think by Ian Toll, I may be mistaken. That was the Chesapeake was the first ship laid there. So that's pretty interesting. Fast forward to April 1861, the shipyard is taken over by a Confederacy shortly after Virginia secedes. So Fort Sumter happens early April 20th, I believe. They destroyed the federal forces. The Navy destroyed the shipyard at Gosport, fearing that the Confederates would take control of the facility, which they, of course, did. And that was actually April 21st, excuse me. The Confederates did take control of it. They were unable to get one of the prize ships of the Navy out. However, that was the USS Merrimack. And rather than give that up to the Confederates, they burned it to the waterline. And I'm sure we will talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But that basically takes us up to Confederate control of Gosport.
Yeah. And in general, Tim, can you give us like a brief overview of ironclads up until, to this point just before the American Civil War and then obviously leading into the American Civil War?
Okay. Excuse me. So first of all, let me backtrack just a little bit because I threw out a lot of terms that people may not know anything about. So what is Hampton Roads, I should say? So Hampton Roads is basically a connection point. If you're familiar with the Civil War, you know Virginia has three peninsulas. The last one is what's known as the York-James Peninsula. It has the York River on the northeastern side, the James River on the southwestern side of it. Where those rivers meet, where the Elizabeth River coming up from the south comes in, that confluence point at the southern tip of the York-James Peninsula, it's what's known as Newport News. That body of water that separates the peninsula from Norfolk is Hampton Roads. So go back to that. And so you want to know about ironclads. So ironclads were they realized that the idea would work during the Crimean War when the French employed what were known as floating batteries, ironclad batteries, basically. They weren't propelled. They basically, but they were able to destroy Russian shore defenses in the Crimea. And the first ironclad was actually built in 1859. It was a French vessel called La Gloire. The English actually had the second in October of 1861. That was the HMS Warrior. Though even then, during the American Civil War, the concept of ironclads was already being developed. You had the City class gunboats that were very prevalent in the West and actually engaged before the Battle of the Ironclads in March of '62. So they participated in Fort Henry, Fort Donelson in February of '62, tying back to your earlier episode.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And let's get on to the construction of the USS Virginia then. Obviously, as you said at the beginning there about the Gospel and them leaving the USS Merrimack down to the waterline. Firstly, who comes up with the idea of constructing this ironclad, the USS Virginia, CSS Virginia? Sorry, I do apologise. Give us an idea of the materials used, where it was built, how many guns it had, how many crew would be on it, and its vulnerabilities and things like that.
Okay, so the idea really came from the Confederate Secretary of the Navy, Stephen Mallory. He gave the order to basically use, basically after the Confederates gained control of Gosport, they identified that the engines, much of the keel or the hull of the Merrimack was still intact, so they were just going to reuse that. So they basically clapped iron over the belt line, basically at the water line just above. This was designed by a Confederate Navy lieutenant known as John Mercer Brooke, was the designer. It had, let's see here, it was 1 to 3 inches of iron belt armor. Once again, in the picture, it would basically be below the gun ports, kind of right there at the water line. Below that, and one of its vulnerabilities was just the keel or the wooden hull of the old Merrimack. It had ultimately, though, it ended up having 800 tons of iron in total placed on top of it. Most of the armor was on what's known as the casemate or casements, which is the area basically the gun deck. Very lightly armored, I think only an inch on the actual deck, the horizontal surface. But the casements had, I think, 1 to 3 inches at the belt and 4 inches on the casements themselves. And then below that was 24 inches of solid oak. So it's 24 inches of oak plus 4 inches of armor. And that armor was angled at 36 degrees. So if you can kind of see on that photo below the stack, it's angled, designed to deflect the shots. It had not in huge armament. They had 4 Brooks rifles, 6 Dahlgren smoothbores, 9-inch Dahlgren smoothbores, and then 2 howitzers, 12-pound howitzers on the top to help repel boarders. And that was the armament. Its biggest weakness was that water line. And as they found, the more ordnance you expend, you wouldn't believe it, but the lighter the ship gets, and the lighter it gets, the more it raises out of the water, it potentially exposing that vulnerable point below the water line. Its other big problem was it had 2 engines. So I think it had two screws, total 4 boilers. but it was very cumbersome to steer. So it would steer, it would take a mile to do a full circle. So it was very unresponsive rudder, basically. Though it could make 5 to 6 knots, which is about 6 to 7 miles per hour. And it carried a crew of 320 men. So it was much, it was, a smaller ship than the Merrimack had been, but carried nearly as many people. It lacked some of the maneuverability. And one of the things the Confederates didn't know was that, so while they were able to recover that engine, prior to the Confederates gained control there at Gosport, the Merrimack's engines were actually designed to be overhauled or scheduled to be overhauled. So that may have been a little bit fortuitous. What else do I want to say? I did mention the turning radius took a mile. That turn to go a mile would take the ship 45 minutes. And that would play a role on March 9th of 62 during the Battle of the Ironclads.
Mm-hmm. And also, I understand it had a ram on the front as well. So just tell us about the idea behind having a ram on the front of the ship, because it's not the only one that has rams. There's plenty of those around, isn't there, at the time?
Right. People have been ramming since the ancient times. So the idea of having a ram, that's a quick, expeditious way to make a big hole in the waterline and sink a ship. It was a 1,500-pound iron ram.
Wow. Yeah. It's really cool. Thanks. It just makes me, it's beggars belief that these things float, isn't it? But interesting
Right.
fact about the fact that as it gets lighter, it comes out the water a bit. I didn't even really ever think about that. So thanks for adding that. Okay, let's talk about the construction of the USS Monitor. So
Okay, so
obviously, and also at this point, do the US know and the federal government know that the Confederates are building the Virginia, and is
well,
that why? So talk us through the how this all comes about.
yeah. So keep in mind, during all of this, the U.S. still has control at Fort Monroe, basically right across from Hampton Roads. Word escapes. There is a escaped slave who basically sends word north that this ship was being built. There are delays in the Virginia. It takes, as I mentioned, it was 800 tons of iron. Procuring all that iron, it had to come from melting down railway ties, and basically any source of iron they could get. The Confederates just didn't have it. So that took a while. So the Union knows they need to respond, and they turned to a guy named John Erickson. He's a Swedish immigrant. He was kind of ticked off at the Navy for some back payments or owed payments. But he agreed to do this, and the USS Monitor was built in 101 days. Some say 98. The turret, however, was designed by a different guy, a guy named Theodore Timby. So not a lot of people give him credit because they give John Erickson all the credit. But it had nearly 60, close to 70 patentable inventions on the Monitor.
Wow.
Made really quick. Crewed by 49 officers and men, so 49 to 300, and was more armored. It was 11 inches near the gun ports on the turret, 8 inches elsewhere. It had the Virginia used 9-pound Dahlgren smoothbores. The Monitor was designed for 15-pound Dahlgren smoothbores, but they couldn't get them in time, so they used 11-inch, so it was still bigger. During the battle, they fired it with a 15-pound charge, but the gun was rated for a 30-pound charge, and they assessed that it actually could have penetrated the Virginia's armor, but they would be concerned. They'd never tested it, firing a full charge in that turret to see what, imagine being a turret and a breach explodes. It's going to kill everybody. So perhaps better that they never tried. It had 3 to 5 inches as opposed to 1 to 3 armor at the belt. there at the waterline, and the armor goes below the waterline on the Monitor. Excuse me. It was capable of 6 knots, so 7 miles an hour, so about the same speed. But one of the bigger advantages for the Monitor is that its draft, the amount, its depth is 10 feet. The Virginia's is 21. And that also plays a role. So once again, designed with a lot of different patents. It's designed to go 360 degrees and can do that in about 45 seconds, I believe. It's got a lever steam engine and one prop. It turns a little bit faster, but compared to Virginia, its bigger advantages is it's lower to the waterline, turns faster, and draws less water. So those are its big advantages.
Yeah, and again, I'll just bring up the turret. So that is actually absolutely revolutionary, isn't it, for that time period? And is that
Yes.
what's adapted then later on in history when you get, rotating tank turrets and even on ships rotating guns eventually, and
Yep.
awesome. Okay, so people have got to live on these vessels. So what is life like for the crews on these two vessels? Because it must be cramped conditions in there.
So it's don't have air conditioning, so any ship can get claustrophobic. The Monitor in particular, they struggled very much with the heat. It would get hotter in there. It's a big floating iron cheese box, basically. So it's attracting all the heat. So they could put up sunshades on the roof. You can kind of see in that bottom picture, you could put a covering over that to try to aid in cooling. But it got very hot, and people would spend as much time on deck, assuming that the weather was cooperating as they could. And the Virginia was not much better. It had more openings, so the interior wouldn't get quite as hot. But it wasn't pleasant. You've got the steam engines working. These things, the steam is it's being fed by coal or fired by coal, so it gets quite hot in addition to the heat from the sun.
Uh-huh. And also these type of vessels, they couldn't go too deep either, I take it.
No, as I said, 10 feet on the Monitor, 21 on the Virginia.
Okay, cool. Okay. Again, I know you did talk about it a little bit. Well, you did talk about it at the beginning, but again, just give us an idea of where Hampton Roads is, and because this time I've actually got a map for that.
Okay, so if you look at the bottom right-hand corner of the map, you have Norfolk. Uh, Basically, that what separates Norfolk from Portsmouth there is the Elizabeth River. Just below where it shows Portsmouth on that bottom right-hand side is where the Gosport Naval Yard is. The Elizabeth River comes up, flowing slightly to the northwest. That point, I don't know if it mentioned, yep, Sewell's Point, there, kind of center right of the picture. That's the current location of the Norfolk Naval Base, one of the largest, if not the largest naval base in the world. Just on the right side of the map, top right-hand corner is Fort Monroe. Northeast of that is where the York River is. So basically, you have the York River dumps out into into Chesapeake Bay. You have coming in from the northwest, you have James River. And as James River gets to that point at the southern tip of the York James Peninsula, that's Newport News Point. And that confluence of the Elizabeth River and the James River is what forms Hampton Roads. So they call it the roadstead, where those two meet. And then Hampton Roads dumps into Chesapeake Bay, where it's met with the York River, before it empties very quickly after that into the Atlantic Ocean.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so let's move on to events of March 8th, 1862. And this is where the action really starts. And of course, the CSS Virginia causes absolute havoc. So, Tim, take us through what happens on the 8th of March, 1862, please.
Okay, so the Virginia leaves early that morning from Gosport. They clear Sewell's Point there, where the Norfolk Naval Base is, around about noon. Move out into the roadstead, and then we'll hang a left, headed for Newport News Point. At anchor, doing laundry and stuff that day are two ships that the Virginia has its sight on. The USS Cumberland and the USS Congress. Accompanying the Virginia are two gunboats, the Jamestown and the Patrick Henry. They'll contribute to the fighting. So basically, the Virginia decides it's going to head for the Cumberland. And the Cumberland sits near what's now one of the southernmost piers at Newport News Naval Shipyard. And there it remains. As Virginia's steaming for the Cumberland, it trades broadsides with the Congress, but they know they're going to be able to come back to the Congress, so they're not worried about it. They head straight for the Cumberland and ram it. The Cumberland very quickly sinks. Losses are pretty horrendous, but I'll talk a little bit more about that. But rather than rest on its laurels, the Virginia moves to the Congress, which has tried to maneuver east, but runs aground, trying to bring its guns to bear on the Virginia. And basically, the Virginia sets it ablaze, with its broadsides. And the Congress runs down its colors and surrenders. The Confederate commander, Flag Officer Franklin Buchanan, I think. Yeah, Franklin Buchanan. He goes topside, but there's a camp there in Newport News. Camp Butler is what it was called. And Union troops basically out from Camp Butler open fire on Buchanan as he's accepting the surrender of the Congress. But the Congress burns and then explodes during the night. The Cumberland's sunk. And it was actually the worst day or deadliest day in the history of the U.S. Navy up to that point, and would be the deadliest day in the U.S. Navy to conclude the sinking of the USS Maine until Pearl Harbor. It was 261 killed, 108 wounded during the battle. For the Cumberland, it was 121 killed out of a crew of 376, and the Congress was 120 out of 434. After setting the surrender of the Congress, they turned their attention to USS Minnesota, which had come in from Chesapeake Bay, but had run aground. There are other ships, though, and basically the long guns, it's getting late. The long guns keep the Virginia and its escorts at bay, so they elect to move back in the Elizabeth River and wait out the night. And that basically ends the fighting on March 8th.
Okay. And where is the USS Monitor at this point during that action that's going on the 8th?
They are steaming down. I think they're being towed, but they're on their way down from New York. They're nearly there during that action. They're probably approaching the bay.
Okay, cool. Okay, so then that obviously does take us on to the famous Battle of the Two Ironclads, and it's quite a clash, isn't it? So, Tim, take us through the what happens at the Battle of Hampton Roads on March 9th, 1862, and take us through the action, please.
Okay, so March 9th. So in the evening of March 8th, round about dark, the crew of the USS Minnesota see a strange shape, floating cheese box coming up on its starboard side, so it's right side, same side actually. Forgot to mention it. The Cumberland had been rammed on its starboard side. But the Monitor came up during the night, anchored on the right side of the Minnesota. Minnesota's, pointed kind of to the southwest, as you can see on that map. The Virginia has heard the South has heard a little bit about the Monitor. There's spies too, but their objective on the 9th, leaving the Elizabeth River, is to wipe out the remainder of the North Atlantic blockading squadron there in Hampton Roads. So the Virginia leaves, heads for Minnesota, and then coming from the bow, out in front of the bow, is this floating cheese box, and they quickly identify it as Monitor. Franklin Buchanan's no longer aboard, having been wounded the day before. He's turned over command to his executive officer, this lieutenant known as, he's got an interesting name. His name is Lieutenant Catesby AP Roger Jones. Very interesting name. But he's got experience in the U.S. Navy before the war. But basically what you see there, this twisting and turning, the Monitor and the Virginia basically just start blasting away each other. It's probable, given the increased size of the Monitor's guns, they were doing damage. The dents to the Virginia were much greater than those on the Monitor. And as I mentioned earlier, the Monitor's guns were rated to fire twice as much powder as they actually were. And they probably could have easily penetrated the Virginia's armor had they wanted to. But basically, they end up circling. The Confederates, though, score probably the biggest victory when looking through the view slit. If you can see, the commander of the vessel of the Monitor would not be located in the turret. That would have been held at the time by, I think, Lieutenant Green, actually. He's worth mentioning because it was Lieutenant Samuel Green. He was, I think, an 1840s graduate of the Naval Academy. He was the executive officer, and his father was George Sears Green, Union general, famous for Culp's Hill at Gettysburg. His son was a Navy officer. But initially, if you're looking at this picture, that little box right at the bow, that's where the commander would be. And there's view slits. And at one point, a Confederate shell hits that, and the gunpowder explodes, and the powder exploding, not splinters or anything like that, but the gunpowder burns the eyes of the commander, Lieutenant John L. Warden, who's been in the U.S. Navy since 1834. He'll become an admiral after the war. So a very effective officer. He'll serve with Admiral Farragut at Mobile Bay, but he's basically out of the fight. So Monitor will basically pull off, and the Virginia will briefly actually run aground, and they'll luckily be able to back off. But Jones wants to keep up the fight, but he's reminded that basically the shifting tides of Virginia draws more water, as we talked about, than the Monitor does, 11 feet more, and is at risk of not being able to clear the various sandbars in Hampton Roads. So it ultimately withdraws back into the Elizabeth River. And the fight is a draw, with the big advantage, that fight's a draw, but the Minnesota and the other ships of the blockading squadron survive. So in my opinion, the Monitor wins that day. Whereas the day before, obviously, Virginia wins a significant victory.
I mean, so again, this battle goes on for 4 hours, doesn't it? And I mean, everyone must have heard it. And what was it? What would you think it was like for the people on, like, some of the ships that was, like the Minnesota and that, seeing this, and do you think they would been watching this battle unfold?
Yeah, and I do wonder whether certainly some must have grasped that this was history making. As we mentioned, the French built the first ironclad vessel, but this was the very first time that two ironclads had engaged each other. So, if something like that happens today, we can be rest assured that most people probably wouldn't know the significance of it because they may not pay attention to military affairs like that. It was probably no different then. But just the noise, the of the guns firing, the clanking of the shells against the armor would have made quite the racket. I'm not sure that there's any accurate reflection of how many shells definitively hit that day. I mean, the Virginia got struck the day before by both the Congress and the Cumberland, but never penetrated. But yeah, it probably would have been a spectacle viewed from the Union troops there at Camp Butler. Would have been viewed by the sailors on the Minnesota and the other vessels there in the roadstead. The Union garrison there at Fort Monroe, and then you have the citizens of Hampton, Newport News, and Norfolk likely would have seen it. So
Yeah. I mean, amazing. Yeah, I mean, I just love this painting. It's just amazing. It really captures that atmosphere. I just want to bring up again. I know we've talked about condition for the guys when they're sailing these ships, but it must have been absolutely horrendous to be on board as they are both being bombarded for 4 hours non-stop. So, just give us an idea of what that was probably like for these guys.
I expect it was probably deafening, especially for the guys in the casements, namely the turret and the casements there on the Virginia. The smoke probably was heavy, especially I think. I mean, if I remember correctly, I think the Monitor. One of the innovations is that they had a kind of not necessarily a recoil system, but it didn't go as far. So more of the smoke probably stayed out than what's the case in Virginia. But just the sheer noise. I mean, imagine being in that turret when a big 11-inch, or 9 to 11-inch ball basically comes smacking, at nearly the speed of sound against solid iron that's only a few inches away from your face there, especially in the Monitor. The Monitor wasn't as thick in terms of the oak, more iron, less oak. But it was probably just as bad, just this continuously loud clanging against the hulls of these ships.
Yeah, you just can't imagine what that must have been like for them.
Yeah, and then when they during the engagement, they tried to ram each other. One thing that the Virginia didn't know, they actually did not know that they lost their ram the day before.
Oh wow!
When they rammed the Cumberland sank so quickly that it basically pulled off the ram, and it was found and sold decades later.
Wow!
But it was common technique, and during the engagement, they tried to ram each other.
Yeah, and again, as you said, it was a draw, but technically a Union victory. Technically, so what happens afterwards then, Tim? Take us through what happens to both vessels after this famous battle of Hampton Roads.
So the let's see. So the Virginia moves back. It's basically under repair until April of 1862. They'll basically try to sally out a couple more times, but never really do anything. They're driven away. The Monitor's still hanging around. Basically, So it sits there in less than 2 months, literally almost 2 months. It was May 10th. Union troops occupied Norfolk. The Virginia was now steam powered and was basically nothing more than a steam powered heavy battery. Wasn't designed to go into the ocean, so they couldn't go try to run through the blockading fleet. The only option would be try to get up the James River. But they identified that it was just, once again, I keep coming back to the draft. It draws 21 feet of water. And it can't get up there. So they determined that they're going to have to dispose of the vessel. So that night, the crew evacuates. Jones sets powder charges. And on the morning of May 11th, large explosion, or the fire and the powder hits the magazines, and the Virginia explodes there in the James River. The Monitor doesn't last much longer, actually. It's under tow later that year, I think August. Hold on. Excuse me. It was being towed in December of 1862 by the tug, the USS Rhode Island, and off the coast of Cape Hatteras, North Carolina. It ran into a heavy storm. It caused the Monitor to take on water rapidly, and the Monitor went down on the 31st of December, 1862, and would remain lost until 1973 when they find the wreckage 18 miles southeast off of Cape Hatteras, North Carolina. Years later, into the 1990s, they recover the turret, which included the two Dahlgren guns. It also included the remains of two crew members who went down with the vessel. They were reburied or buried in Arlington National Cemetery, and the turret and guns went to what's known as the Mariners Museum in Newport News, so very fitting. Went under conservation for the better part of a decade, and today you can go into the Mariners Museum. You can see the turret of the Monitor, the original guns. They also have a recreated cross-section of the turret. It's a fantastic exhibit. Also there on site is one of the guns of the Virginia. I think they also have the Monitor's anchor, or maybe it's Virginia's anchor. It's been a while since I've been there. But other ships that looked like the Virginia were produced by the Confederacy, but the Monitor probably had a bigger impact because it generated an entire class of ship. The Monitor class, similar designs, the turret. Ships called Monitors were produced up through the early 20th century.
Yeah. And all that's left to say is I've really enjoyed listening to you tell us the story behind Hampton Roads, and thank you very much.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Thanks.